Hello, hello, hello again. This is Hunter with anyonecanplayguitar.org with lesson number 4, I believe, of our rhythm basics for the guitar. Today, we're going to talk about silence. Because you don't always want to hear stuff. In fact, I like not hearing stuff a lot. So when we're writing rhythms, sometimes we want to include elements of silence, little breaks in the sound. You've all heard this kind of stuff used in music. The whole band will stop, or one instrument will stop, or something like that for a beat or two, or maybe longer, and then come back in. So there's a really nice break for the music, right? It kind of breaks up the constant notes, right? Gives you a little time to breathe. So what we're going to look at today are rests. All right, so let's take a look here. We've got different note types that we've talked about. 4 of them to be exact. We have the whole note, the half note, the quarter note, and the eighth note. And just like we have different types of notes, each note type has a corresponding rest. So basically it's a placeholder for that note. It takes up the same amount of time as that note, but instead of playing something, you just don't play. Alright? So a whole rest is a line here with a little rectangle box underneath it. And I remember that by thinking of it as like a hole, right? This line kind of resembles maybe the horizon, and then you have a little dip in it. It looks kind of like a hole, right? It's a whole rest right there. So this whole note lasts for 4 beats. The whole rest also lasts for 4 beats. The difference is that you just count 4 without doing anything instead of playing a note and sustaining that note. The half note is the same style thing as the whole, the half rest rather, except it's upside down. Just flip that whole rest upside down and you get a half rest. The way I keep the two separate is that this looks like a hole and this looks like a hat. I don't know, works for my brain. Looks like a hat for half. They sound similar, so that works for me. Alright, so the quarter rest is kind of funky. It looks like that. It looks like somebody just scribbled onto a piece of paper, but that's what it looks like. And if you've got a calligraphy pen, you can make it even fancier, which you often see in music. So it's kind of like, maybe if you want to think of it as like a very blocky or a straight-edged 3, and then the bottom gets sort of a curled around. That's how I do it. And finally, our 8th note rest is something like that. Kind of resembles maybe like a percent sign with missing the other part here, except that this is filled in. Anyway, they're very ornate looking. So I'd just get out a piece of paper and look up some images of quarter rests and half rests and eighth rests, and just take a couple minutes out of your day and just try writing a few of them. It won't take you very long to get used to it, but it's important to do that and to practice writing out different notes. Just like it's important to be able to write legibly when you're writing a letter or a note or whatever. You have to be able to communicate. The whole point of writing is to communicate your thoughts to the page or the page to somebody else or whatever, so you need to be able to write clearly and be understood. So take the time to get used to writing those out. Alright, so those are our different types of rests, and every rest corresponds to a different note. So let's take the rhythm that we looked at in the last lesson, and let's just kind of rewrite it using a rest instead of a tie. Alright, so as you may recall, we had a quarter on 1, we had 2/8 on 2, so that's 1, and that's a downstroke, and then down up there, 2 and. Alright, now on 3, we didn't strum. Right? We didn't strum again on 3 because in the last example we had a tie there. So we would strum on the end of 2, but then we would just hold that note over through beat 3. So in this time though, we're going to take that beat 3 there, and we're going to replace it with a rest, specifically an 8th note rest. So then we have on the other half of beat 3, we have just a regular old 8th note by itself, so it doesn't get paired up anymore. And then on beat 4, we had 2 more 8th notes. Alright, so I'm jumping right into the 8th note rest, which you might think is crazy, but I think it works just fine. And that is because I'm assuming that you did as I requested and took the time after the last lesson to just get really good at that rhythm that we played, because it is so very applicable. And if you have done that, and I hope you did, then this will be a piece of cake. But the difference will be subtle but important. We'll hear the difference between this being a tied note that is just sustained, or it being a rest, which means no sound. Alright, so typically when I want to play a rest, I'm coming off of having played some notes and I want to mute the strings. I do that in a couple ways depending on the chord. What I'll do is kind of a combination of releasing the pressure off the fingers. So it's not really a great way to show you this, but I think you can get the gist of it. I'm pushing the strings down to play the chord, and then when I want to release the pressure, I don't take my fingers off, but I just kind of let them bounce up off the strings. See if you can see that at all. Right? So I'm either playing the notes or just letting the pressure off without moving, because I know I'm going to have to go right back to pushing them down in a second. So I do that, and that works for any note that is being fretted. Anything that's not being fretted, you just can kind of lay the fingers or the hand down over the strings to mute them. All right, we want pure silence during that rest. Alright, so let's give this rhythm a try. We won't bother with beat this time. I'll use E minor. So I'm feeling in a minor mood now. Things have changed. Here we go. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3. So on 3, I have a rest. Just laying my hand across, just to mute the strings. Right? Compare that to what we did before. And you can hear the difference. The right hand for both is the same, but one we're letting that beat 3 just ring, which is nice. You know, it sounds nice. It's pleasing because there's no break in the sound. And the other one where we throw that rest in, there's a clear moment where we're hearing nothing. Now this can be effective. You can take one rhythm and kind of let the notes ring and sustain, and that can be one effect that you might be going for. Or you can be very percussive with it and add in lots of breaks and rests and sort of short notes, right? And that just gives you a different sound, you know, more percussive sound. So let's try another little example here with just 8th notes again, so we can hear what I'm talking about here. I'm going to do 2 measures. The first measure is just going to be quarter notes, 4 quarter notes. One, 2, 3, 4, and of course those are down strums. Alright, and then the second one I'm going to put an 8th, and then an 8th rest on each beat. Alright, so it's kind of funky. It's the same, we're still strumming on beats 1, 2, 3, and 4 right on the beat, but instead of it being a quarter note, which would last for the entire beat, basically sustain over the entire duration of the beat, we're now throwing in a rest on the end of each beat. So there's this very subtle difference here, but an important one. Let's go to A minor. Alright, so I'm either letting the notes ring. There are no rests here, so I just let each note ring until I strum the next chord, and there's no interruption of sound. But in this one, I have to mute the strings in between each chord, or each strum. All right, so you hear the difference. I'll do both measures right in a row. Here we go. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, hear the difference? So it's kind of cool, because I'm strumming the same way the entire time. I'm strumming on the beat, which would imply maybe quarter notes, but because these are an eighth with a rest on the second half, I have to observe that rest and make a conscious effort to stop the sound. Now there are other ways to do this, which will come later in future lessons. Lots of ways to manipulate kind of the dynamics or the way in which a note is played as opposed to how long or short the note is. But this is a good example of how rests can, pretty strongly affect the way the sound, or the song sounds, or the chord, or whatever you're playing. Okay, so that's basically rests. I was going to say some more, but I don't think there's very much more to say. You have different types of notes. So we have quarters, halves, wholes, and our eighths, and each note has a corresponding rest, and the rest just represents the same amount of space that note takes up, except you just have no sound. Now I should say on the guitar, personally, I'm a little less strict about rests than maybe a flute player would be, or a trumpet player, or somebody playing more of a classical piece or something like that, where if I see a rest, sometimes I just interpret that as meaning don't strum, rather than cut sound completely. In music theory and in the language of music in general, a rest pretty much means there should be no sound, right? You should mute your instrument and there should be silence. But I think and that's true, and I think you should probably do that if possible, but there will be plenty of times when you can get away with a rest not being a pure silence and a cut of sound so much as just don't strum there, right? Don't renew the sound, but don't necessarily have to cut the sound. Now again, that's my personal philosophy, so that might not jive with some other teacher or some other musician that you play with, but understand the difference, that because the guitar is used so commonly in popular styles of music, it's kind of like just a little less stingy and a little less strict about stuff like that. Strictly speaking, there should be silence. Guitar speaking, do whatever you want. Have fun with it. All right, I think we're coming up to the end of this series. I thank you for getting this far. We're covering a lot of stuff pretty fast, so if you have any questions, please leave them for me. Go back and watch the videos, which is a really great way to kind of watch the video, get the foundation, get that sort of blurry map going on in your brain, and then when you watch it again, you might clarify some points, and you watch it again, you might really solidify some points, and certainly if you can have your guitar with you to strum along with the rhythms that I'm showing you, that will help you even more. Alright, so in the fifth and final lesson, as far as we're going to go for basics, we're going to talk about 16th notes. 16th notes. Alright, here we go. Lesson number 5. See ya.